Professor Dershowitz, first of all, thank you very much for staying up late tonight. I know it's midnight out on the East Coast, but we wanted to get your reaction. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Your reaction to the jury verdict, finding not guilty verdicts on second-degree murder and manslaughter regarding George Zimmerman.
Well, it was the right verdict. There was reasonable doubt all over the case. Nobody knows who struck the first blow. Nobody knows who yelled and screamed, "Help me, help me." We don't know for sure who was on top and who was on bottom, except that the only forensic evidence had George Zimmerman on the bottom and his head being banged against the floor. If not for public pressure, this case never would have been brought. There was a reasonable doubt right from the very beginning, and I think the prosecutor acted irresponsibly by charging second-degree murder right from the very beginning. So this was a very easy case as a matter of law, and it came to the right result. You know, morally, it's a very complicated case because George Zimmerman bears moral responsibility for following him, for not obeying the police order, for perhaps racially profiling. But as far as the crime is concerned, he had a defense that was valid under the law, and the jury appropriately found reasonable doubt.
Professor Dershowitz, you made a comment about it was brought for the wrong reasons.
Right.
Can you explain upon that? Because my concern here is that the prosecution role is to bring cases that they honestly believe there is plausible evidence to find a conviction. You're saying basically there was no evidence from the word go.
That's right. There was compelling evidence of reasonable doubt right from the beginning. You could not bring this case without knowing that there would be great doubt and that there would be reasonable doubt as a matter of law. The DA initially investigated the case. The police investigated the case. They did a very thorough investigation, and they concluded, as I think any responsible police department would have concluded, and any responsible prosecutor would have concluded, that this is not a case that could be brought to court, that there was reasonable doubt, and that as a matter of law there was reasonable doubt. And then there was all kind of public pressure brought. And the reason this case was brought is because we have elected prosecutors in the United States and because we have elected judges. We're the only country in the world that elects prosecutors. In no country that has professional prosecutors would a case like this be brought. And the prosecutor was irresponsible. She has the worst reputation among all the prosecutors in Florida for overcharging. And nobody expected her to charge second-degree murder. People were hoping maybe there would be a charge of manslaughter. But she charged second-degree murder. And then in the middle of the trial, she wanted to get a felony murder trial based on child abuse. I mean, she is utterly, utterly irresponsible as a prosecutor. And the jury, you know, thank God we have juries in this country, the jury exercised good sense, and the jury isn't elected. They don't have to run for re-election. They listened to the evidence, and they said, of course there's a reasonable doubt. How can anybody here be sure? Remember, reasonable doubt is like 90-95%. Even if you're 80% certain that George Zimmerman was guilty, you have to acquit. 80% isn't enough. And in this case, when you don't know who struck the first blow, when you don't know who was on top and who was on bottom, you don't know who was yelling, you have to have speculation. And you can't convict somebody based on speculation. The government has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that George Zimmerman did not act in self-defense, and they just couldn't do it. It was an impossible burden to place on the prosecution.
Let me keep pressing the issue about the political pressure.
Right.
The elephant in the room is race. Race is not an element of either one of these charges, but was the political pressure based on the fact that the identity of Trayvon Martin being an African-American young man and George Zimmerman being a non-African-American, was that the political pressure, the race element that brought the need or the pressure on the Attorney General to bring this charge?
Of course. I mean, we have a terrible history in this country of racism and racial profiling directed against young black men. And it's understandable that there'd be political pressure. This case resonated for many in the African-American community as being one of many cases where young black men are profiled, inappropriately profiled, and end up dead, usually as a result of police misconduct. And so it's very understandable there'd be political pressure based on the race of the defendant and the race of the victim. But it's the job of the prosecutor to resist political pressure and to look at the facts of the case and to look at the law. And if you look at the facts and you apply the law, you have to say there was a reasonable doubt here. It may be that George Zimmerman is morally culpable, morally responsible, that but for his actions, vigilante actions, maybe racial profiling, but for that, there never would have been the tragedy of a dead young man who is unarmed. But you have to, if you're a prosecutor, not allow that kind of political, emotional, historical reality to interfere with looking at the facts of this particular case. And the facts of this particular case cry out reasonable doubt. You simply cannot conclude that there is no reasonable doubt in this case.
On the line is Harvard Law professor Alan Dershowitz. Professor Dershowitz still playing the issue of the race card by the mere fact that, as you stated, there was reasonable doubt from the word go.
Right.
The political pressure of race being an issue by virtue of an obvious acquittal. Doesn't that send the wrong message to those African Americans who believe, oh, no justice, no peace, there was a problem here, and this was the wrong case to test whether or not Mr. Zimmerman committed a crime when there was really no evidence to prove it?
This was the wrong case.
Yeah.
Tragically, there are so many other cases that I know I've experienced in my life where police have, without any plausible claim of self-defense, shot and killed young African American children or adults. And those are the right cases to bring. Here you have private citizen acting like a policeman. We shouldn't allow these kinds of vigilante groups. I hate the stand your ground law that Florida has, and I think there are, too many guns in Florida and too easy to get guns in Florida. So, from a political point of view, I understand that I'm very, very sympathetic to the family of Trayvon Martin and to the folks who were hoping there would be a conviction. But if you look at the facts of this case, it just wasn't the right case to bring.
I agree with you 100%. Professor Dershowitz, I know you're 3 hours ahead of us. I want to thank you very much for staying up late for us, and I appreciate your time here on Talk Radio 790 KBC.
Thank you so much.
There's nothing to brag about. But last week, July 4th, when I was filling in for Peter Tillman, I said there was a not guilty verdict coming in because the evidence, as Professor Dershowitz said, the evidence was weak. And unfortunately, the cable stations have made this a race issue. This was the wrong case to declare racial injustice because the prosecution had zero facts to prove a second-degree murder charge. A second-degree murder charge requires an intentional killing with ill will, hatred, or spite. It did not exist. It did not exist in this case. And yet, the prosecution brought this case for political reasons. And what has happened? It has divided this country along racial lines. 1-800-222-KABC, 1-800-222-KABC. On the line as well, former prosecutor, Riverside County, and a co-host of mine from yesterday, Robin Sachs. Robin, welcome to Talk Radio 790 KBC.
So happy to be here.
You're late. Where were you? I'm joking.
What do you mean I'm late? Are you kidding? I was calling you, wanting to know you, but you can't, text more than, one letter every 5 hours.
Fair enough.
It's a long time to communicate.
Robin, if newsflash, George Zimmerman found not guilty, your reaction, please.
My first reaction was, oh my God, a jury that follows the law. Because while everyone out there is saying, I don't want to say everyone, a very large group or half of the group out there is saying, well, what do you expect? This is Casey Anthony all over again. This is not Casey Anthony all over again. In Casey Anthony, they had evidence. In this case, they didn't. And the jury was brave to make a decision and actually make a decision, not millions of readbacks, not vacillating, not cajoling by the judge to make a decision. 1, 2 questions, couple asked for evidence, and a dinner break, and they had an answer.
Well, then the question is, because, we talked about it yesterday. I mean, many of the so-called legal analysts claim that there was not enough evidence for second-degree murder or manslaughter. The question then is, why was the case brought forward in the first place?
You know what? I challenge all of those legal analysts.
Well, don't challenge me. Don't challenge me, because I was out there and I said, based on the evidence presented in the case, there was no evidence here.
I agree, and you did say that. I was right there next to you when you did. And actually, the first time I heard it earlier in the week, out of your mouth specifically, I was I was not only surprised, but I was impressed. But let me tell you, it took 3 weeks for people to be brave enough to say what people should have said, like I did at the beginning, and I did. This case was overcharged from day one. The prosecution succumbed to the pressure, and this is as a prosecutor. I was a prosecutor in L.A. and a prosecutor in Riverside, and the worst thing you can do as a prosecutor is bring forth charges that you're going to lose. Not only does it not end up in the result that you want, but if you are wanting to send a message to other people out there, let's say other gun-toting neighborhood watch vigilantes, because I do think that George Zimmerman did wrong things, not necessarily enough to have, not that there was the evidence to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt of murder too, but he did do things that were, I wouldn't prefer people out there in society doing. And now the message to those people is, I can do what George Zimmerman did, and I don't think that is the message I want people to have either.
Oh, I agree with you 100%. The problem here is because of political pressure, and apparently this state prosecutor has a history of overcharging, this is one of these cases that is being used to divide this country. As I had the opportunity to watch some of the cable stations, and unfortunately, Al Sharpton, Jesse Jackson, they're playing the race card on a case where the evidence was overwhelming, and race, regardless of color of the participants in this case, the outcome would have been the same.
If I could point my finger to one person who is causing the divide, who's making racism more prevalent, who's inciting anger and pain, it's Al Sharpton.
Yeah.
And the fact that MSNBC keeps him on that station is unbelievable to me. I just read the post and his statement. He's planning on taking this to the feds, treating this like a Rodney King. This just is not a race case.
I agree.
It never was.
It was never a race case. Let me give you my spin on this case from the word go. This case has divided this nation. And it was a wrong case, if ever there is a case, to divide a country. This was not a case of racism, but it was made as a case of a black man and a non-African American. Let me submit to you that if George Zimmerman was black, this case never gets national attention. You don't care as much. But because one person is black, skin color wise, someone is non-black, skin color, all of a sudden, our country's moral high ground is being tested on the issue of race. It is insulting to have this case brought solely for political and racial reasons. And you have people like Al Sharpton, who are on his political soapbox, playing the race card. Here is defense attorney Mark O'Mara when asked if race was a factor.
The prosecution raised this question about whether the outcome would be different if the races of the defendant and the victim were different. Do you think it would have been different if George Zimmerman was black?
Well, I think that the things would have been different if George Zimmerman was black for this reason. He never would have been charged with a crime.
How about that? The elephant in the room is the race card. And for those people who wanted to believe that George Zimmerman was guilty of second-degree murder, shame on you. In a court of law, people are found guilty or innocent based on evidence, not feelings, not beliefs, not hunches, not speculation. And people in this country has been duped to believe this was a race case. It was not a race case.